Now, of course, we all know that by the 18th century, firearms and the bayonet as backup had really become the preeminent weapons both on the battlefield and in civilian life for self-defense. However, swords were still super important, and one sword had triumphed above most others, certainly in civilian life, and that was the small sword, or rapier as it was still sometimes known in the 18th century. But really, this is a diminutive cousin of the rapier, hence the name small sword. However, I would assert that while the small sword was awesome as a dueling weapon against other small swords, in military and civilian life, it more or less sucked, but with one saving grace. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. So we have here a genuine antique mid-18th century small sword. Now, there's no question that by the time you get to the 18th century in civilian life, the main dueling weapons were either pistols or small swords. And usually when people had a duel, which were illegal in most places, but they still happened, when they had a duel, they either did it with a pistol or a small sword. Moreover, in civilian self-defense, the pistol and the small sword were very common implements. Not the only ones. There were hangers, there were blunderbusses, and other things as well. But the small sword and the pistol were very, very popular. However, on the battlefield, from at least the middle to later part of the 18th century, so let's say the latter part of the 1700s, while some officers had worn the small sword as a badge of office, they really started to be supplanted, even for infantry officers, and sometimes even by superior officers who weren't really expected to fight at all. The small sword had started to be replaced by other things. I would assert because it more or less sucks as a military sidearm, but moreover, it actually kind of sucks as a civilian self-defense sidearm as well. We're going to look at why, and then we're going to look at one saving grace it has. So before we go into comparing this with a few other contemporary swords of the period, we're just going to very briefly mention firearms again, because of course the elephant in the room is that swords at this period exist in a context in which flint-locked muzzle-loading firearms have become really very efficient and very well made, relatively reliable if you know what you're doing and you load them correctly and look after them correctly. Such that, yes, obviously, as far as the first exchanges are concerned, if firearms are involved, there's not an awful lot the sword can do. But before I go on, just remember this is the age, for the most part, of muzzle-loading single-shot firearms. So something like this blunderbuss might be absolutely devastating at close range, and yes, you've got a bayonet as a backup. However, this is not a very long-reaching weapon, this blunderbuss in this case, and even if you've got a musket with a bayonet on the end, there are things that with a sword, once that firearm has been discharged, with a sword you can do against that person with a bayonet. So swords still had a very important place at this time, because of course in a melee, skirmish, self-defense, multiple opponent situation where one person is dealt with the firearm, assuming it takes them out, assuming it even hits them, then after that you need hand weapons, hence the importance of bayonets still, because you don't have time or space to reload. So assuming all the firearms have been discharged and used and you're now down to hand weapons, here is the small sword. And yes, it's certainly better than having nothing. It's certainly better than, in fact, lots of other types of hand weapons. I would put this above a tomahawk. I would put this up above most types of short kind of sword and knife and things like this. But we're going to look at here three contemporary types of swords, which I believe basically trump this in most combat. Okay, so three important swords that were around at the same time as this small sword. So the first example we're going to look at here is a very close cousin of the small sword, and it is the spadrone. That's right, the spadrone hasn't featured on my channel for a little while. It's become a little bit of a meme. If you're new to the channel, there are many memes and jokes about spadrones, because I think a lot of people think that I hate spadrones. In fact, I don't. I hate some spadrones. As it turns out, I actually quite like this one. Now, what is a spadrone? Well, you'll notice that it has a superficially similar setup to a small sword, but the primary, and they, you know, with two shell guards, a knuckle bow, it's a similar size, this kind of thing. But the primary difference between the small sword and the spadrone is the spadrone essentially has a narrow broadsword blade. Now, I know that might sound like a complete contradiction. It was known at the time sometimes as a shearing sword, or various other names it went by, but essentially it's a relatively narrow but double-edged, usually they can be single-edged as well, blade. This is double-edged. And this has been service sharpened. Incidentally, for the sword geeks out there, for anyone who doesn't know, this is the 1796, so yes, it's quite late for this period, but it's representative of earlier types of spadrone as well. The 1796 heavy cavalry dress officer's sword. They were sometimes worn militarily, they weren't only worn as dress swords, and in fact many of them, including this example, have been service sharpened, presumably when they were being worn around in the Napoleonic Wars, when a person wasn't sitting on a horse wearing their cavalry sword. And it's got a fairly substantial hilt. Now the general difference between this and the small sword, and I'm going to explain the reasons why I think this is better than a small sword, both in war and in civilian self-defense, is it has a more robust hilt in general than small swords. Okay, so it's a bit heavier, it's a bit chunkier, a bit bigger, thicker guard, usually a more robust knuckle bow. Obviously you could make a bigger small sword, but most of them don't tend to be. But the most important feature is the fact that you have a cut and thrust blade. So admittedly it is more flexible. You can see this is quite flexible, this blade. So you could argue, and in fact people did argue in the 18th century and people still argue now, that the small sword is better because it's got a more rigid blade, a triangular section blade, at least this one has, which means it will penetrate through clothing more easily and be more fatal. And that admittedly is the main advantage of the small sword. However, this will still stab, this will still do the job of most other swords. It's still, you know, it's not crazy flexible, but it's really quite a light sword which you can give snap cuts or moulinet cuts really, really quickly with. Now, why is this important? Quite simply because if you're facing an opponent with a small sword who's trying to stab you, okay, they're going to be primarily, we'll come to this at the end because there is one major strength of the small sword, they're going to be primarily aiming at your head and torso, okay, and you will notice as I'm holding this thing out, whether I'm in prime, second, terce or quarte, my hand is extended and fairly exposed because you do not have much of a hilt or handguard on a small sword. That means that any time that the opponent, especially with a double-edged blade, is able to get over the top of your hand or underneath your hand, any of these motions from the spadrone are going to be hitting your hand, okay? Now, they might not sever the hand, they might not sever the arm, this kind of thing, but they're going to be debilitating, disabling. As someone who has had a broken finger, and I have seen dozens of broken fingers from swords, fingers aren't that difficult to break with blunt swords. And when we're wearing protection, okay, with a sharp sword, not only are you liable to break the digits, but of course it's sharp, so it will also cut the fingers, cut the tendons, the muscles, all of this kind of stuff of the hand. So not only have you got an exposed hand, but you've also got big old veins and other things and tendons and stuff and muscle in your wrist and forearm. So the fact that this is a cut and thrust weapon, yes, it might not be, you know, if you say that for penetrative power the small sword is 100%, this might only be 80%, might only be 60%, but it can still stab. So not only have you got a similar, if not quite as much degree of nimbleness and quickness of the point compared to the small sword, but you've got the ability to do these little cuts which are going to be really debilitating and annoying to anyone who's trying to thrust you with a small sword. So many of the advantages of a small sword, lightness, quickness of point, this kind of thing, but the ability to cut to some extent as well. So I would say pound for pound, comparing the small sword and the spadrone, both in a civilian self-defense situation and a military situation, the spadrone has the upper hand over the small sword. Now, if we take this even further, what's a sword which can cut even a bit better than the spadrone, but without adding a huge amount of size or weight or inconvenience? The saber. And here we've got a Napoleonic French infantry officer's saber. Now you'll notice this particular one is actually a little bit longer than standard, so it does have a bit more reach than the spadrone, but it has a blade which is going to cut even better. And I assure you that this is a really light sword, so don't think that just because the blade looks a bit wider, because remember it's generally speaking a little bit thinner, certainly up here, It's also got a more minimalistic hilt. So this is actually a much lighter hilt than the comparatively chunky double shell guarded spadrone here. So it's got some mass taken away in the hilt. This means that the centre of gravity is a little bit further away from the hand. The sort of centre of percussion. This has a curved blade as well, which is going to assist somewhat in the draw and the follow through and the draw through of the cut. So this is a superior cutting sword to the straight spadrone, but obviously, as you've noticed, at the expense of two things. At the expense of hand protection, it's only got a simple knuckle blow, this particular example, to make it light, and thrusting ability. Now this particular one, the French infantry officer's Saber, it has two disadvantages as far as thrusting is concerned. Number one, it is curved. That's not to say you can't thrust with it, you can thrust with it. However, thrusts with curved blades are never really, and even historically, were not considered as effective as thrusts with straight blades, because the energy wants to go in a straight line and this doesn't have a straight line. So the back end of the sword always wants to divert when you make contact with something resistive, like an opponent's uniform or anything else, their body basically. In addition to that, this particular model has what we would call a hatchet point or an asymmetrical tip with the tip at the back. So that's going to exacerbate that problem. So pound for pound, yes, this is less good at thrusting compared to the spadrone, or indeed, obviously, compared to the small sword, which you could say is the king of the point. Okay, but here's the thing: when you're actually in combat with someone, when you're actually fighting someone who wants to get their point in, is most of the time they can bring the hand back. They can go into guards like William Hope that bring the hand a little bit further away. But anytime they want to reach out to get you, okay, they have got to extend the arm. In that situation, you can always back off or traverse and cut the arm or cut the hand. So coming against a sword like this that's going to be constantly moving around in the zone where you want to extend your arm is really quite a daunting thought. And in fact, if we look later to someone like Alfred Hutton, he actually talks about the fight of the Saber against the small sword, or épée at the time. And this is basically the thing, is that if you've got the Saber, just take out the person's hand. Every time they extend their hand and extend that point to try and get you, move away and aim at their extended arm. Now, not only that, there's an important point here about the spadrone and the Saber, which we haven't yet mentioned, and that is other things you're likely to face on the battlefield, or in civilian self-defense. If you're carrying a small sword and you come against an opponent, if they've got a small sword, that's fine, they cancel out. However, if they've got a Saber and they're swinging it at you and they're trying to take your head off or take your arm off, you are now trying to parry and deal with the weapon, which has a lot more inertia than yours. It's difficult to parry, it's liable to damage your hilt, possibly break or bend your blade. It is just physically very difficult to parry heavier swords with a lot of momentum with a lighter, essentially foil-like weight. I mean, these weigh about 400 grams. Trying to parry these heavier weapons with these is very, very challenging. Now, you can do it. And we've talked about this before. This is a Kolishmad small sword, so it has a broadened section at the base of the blade. So that does assist. I'm not going to say that that's the reason that that's there, although some people say it is. I think it's more nuanced than that. But that does assist, and if you parry at the base of the blade, and I've done it myself with épée versus broadswords and sabres in the past, if you parry close to the hand, you can do it. Okay. However, sabres and spadrones are one thing. When you've got someone coming at you with a musket with a bayonet on the end, obviously this is just a short blunderbuss, but for representative purposes, if you imagine with someone with a full-size musket and a bayonet, which you have to remember is the most common weapon on the battlefield, most common hand weapon on the battlefield, or most common weapon on the battlefield actually. All infantry have muskets. Even cavalry have musketoons like this. Infantry, if they come at you in hand to hand, are going to be coming at you with a musket with a bayonet on the end. Now, these are heavy weapons. A full-size musket with a bayonet on the end weighs about 8 or 9 pounds usually, sometimes even more, sometimes 10 pounds. So they are heavy weapons. They're heavier than most medieval poleaxes, and they're being thrust at you, potentially even the butts coming up. If you are trying to defend yourself with a small sword, it is a tall order. And yes, you can run the person through, and that's great, and that's what you're going to aim to do with this. But trying to defend, if they initiate the movement, rather than just doubling, they run at you with their bayonet and you run at them with your sword. Yes, you could run each other through. But if you're actually trying to stay alive and defend against sabres, muskets, with bayonets on the end and things like this, really, really difficult. So the advantage of these slightly beefier swords, even the spadrone and certainly the saber, is they are, in terms of weight and sort of inertia and momentum, far more capable at dealing with the big heavy weapons like these or spontoons or cavalry swords that might be swung at you. And I want to remind viewers that this also applies to civilian self-defense. Maybe not the duel, because in the duel, of course, both people will have matched weapons, so it becomes a moot point. But in self-defense, you don't know what a person's going to swing at you. They could be swinging a wood chopping axe or a shovel or just a lump of wood, or any other kind of large sword, you know, or indeed they could be swinging the butt end of a musket at you. So against all of these sorts of weapons, I consider the small sword is terribly equipped, whereas the spadrone and the saber, pretty good. Now, the last common type of sword of the 18th century, which I think the small sword is overall terribly, terribly equipped to deal with, apart from all the ones we've looked at so far, is a weapon which was very popular in Britain, as it happens at this time, and that is the absolutely awesome basket-hilted broadsword or backsword. Backsword if it's got one edge, broadsword if it's got two. This is a backsword. Now, the problem with these is all of the problems we've looked at so far with things like the spadrone and the saber. Okay, they've got more momentum, more mass, the ability to cut. These are all huge problems for the small sword swordsman. But with the basket hilt, you've got a couple of other really big problems. Okay, with those, at least you can stab them in the hand relatively easily, which we're going to come to in a second. But with the basket hilt, especially if it has the leather liner, this doesn't have one anymore, but it would have had originally, so they often have a buff leather, sometimes fabric layered with leather, liner inside the basket. So yes, there are holes, but they would have been filled by a liner originally. But even if it doesn't have the liner there, you've still got an awful lot of bars to navigate, and that not only protects your hand, but it also often protects the line to your arm when you're actually fighting. Okay, so that's the first thing, huge amount of hand protection. Second thing is the size of this thing. When a person's coming at you Rob Roy style, dealing with these attacks, you're really going to have to back off. If a person swings at you full committed power with a big backsword or broadsword like this, your chances of successfully parrying it with this sword, you can do it, but I would say, based on my experience, and I have actually destroyed an epee blade doing this, you can't do it for long. You can't parry many times because that blade is going to bend or break. More importantly, the tang. Usually the tang snaps off inside the grip. So they're just not built for dealing with the mass and power of these swords. But here's the final thing, and I think this sometimes gets overlooked. These are longer, okay? So you've got an enormous amount more reach with most of these. Now, not with all of them necessarily. So just to use imperial measurements, so small swords are usually between 30 and 34 inch blades, but most of them are about 32 inches, 31, 32 inches. These basket-hilted backswords and broadswords, especially if they're cavalry swords, are very often blades of 35, 36, 37, up to 40 inches long, sometimes over that, but usually between 35 and 40 inches long. So they have a reach advantage. They can cut. Of course, they can still thrust. They might not be fantastic at thrusting. In fact, they're pretty cruddy at thrusting, but they can still thrust. So they've got greater reach, they can outcut, they can outpower, and they've got better hand protection. So really, I do not envy the person trying to use a small sword against somebody with a broadsword or backsword. And once again, that applies to military life or civilian self-defense. So overall, I don't want you to think I hate small swords, because I actually kind of love them. They're lovely things to handle. And small sword against small sword, which of course gives us the basis for modern fencing, whether it's foil or epee, is really enjoyable, really fun, incredibly skillful, of course, and people who are very good at it and practice well usually wipe the floor with people who don't, who might be good with another sword. It is a very particular skill, set to itself because the weapons are so light and so quick and the parameters are so small. So, you know, I have a lot of respect for it as a weapon and also it as a system. And I do it. I do practice a little bit of small sword myself. But overall, as you can tell, I've no doubt by this point, I think the small sword historically sucks for either civilian self-defense or on the battlefield as an infantry officer's weapon. You certainly couldn't use it, unless you really had to, on horseback as a cavalry weapon. But even as an infantry officer, it kind of sucked. And that's why weapons like the spadrone and the saber basically took over from it as we get into the Napoleonic era. However, if you are a person who happens to be wearing a small sword, what do you do against these other swords? So this is one of the things that I try to impress upon my viewers on this channel, is that sometimes it's not about choosing the bestest, you know, it's not top trumps, it's not Magic the Gathering, it's not having the best set of cards. Sometimes you have to play the hand that you're dealt. And if you are a gentleman in the 18th century, let's say 1750, and you are walking around, travelling, let's say, between London and Portsmouth, and that is the sword that society has decreed that you wear, and you get attacked by highwaymen. Funnily enough, I live on the road from London to Portsmouth, and this was an area literally where I live where there were a lot of highwaymen at this time. If you get attacked by a highwayman who attacks you, let's say with a basket-hilted sword like this, or a hanger or whatever, what on earth do you do? Well, so my basic advice is this, and this is the bit where I think, I know that there are other HEMA people who watch my channel, of course. Comment down below, apart from using your guns, let's assume the guns have been shot, okay? So my basic advice is this, is don't get into a parrying game particularly against the basket-hilted broadsword or something of that kind of power. I think you can probably get away with it against a shearing sword or a spadrone. And possibly you can get away with parry and riposte against a lighter saber, but not probably a heavier one. And you wouldn't want someone with a hanger or a short sword, something like a hunting hanger, to get close enough to you in order to really be needing to parry and riposte. So my overall advice is this, is run away, kind of. Run away within a certain area. Keep your distance, okay? What I'm saying here sort of allies with Hutton's advice of using the épée against the saber. And that is, keep your distance as far away as you possibly can, moving around, moving off, so that when the person attacks, you are only close enough to be able to hit their hand or arm. And this is what you should be doing over and over and over again. Now, obviously, if a person has got a fairly open hilt like this infantry officer's saber, or, you know, hunting hanger or something like that, then this is going to be easier. Every time they swing at you, move off either tangentially or backwards and thrust them in the incoming hand and arm. This is playing to the strengths of this sword because it's incredibly quick. You can get in and get out without needing to parry some of the time. And the point is so acute and so powerful at penetrating. If you hit someone in the front of the hand here, that blade will penetrate, go through their arm and come out somewhere here, which will in itself kind of parry because you're basically stabbing them through the arm. So, create distance, keep distance, run away a bit if you need to, and every time they come at you, nail them in the incoming arm that's attacking you. Now, obviously, that is going to be more risky if they are using a sword with a bigger, more protective hilt and longer reach. But that's the hand that you've been dealt. Those are the cards you've been dealt. And what else can you realistically do? There is one other option. And this is high risk, I would say. It's not necessarily within my nature as a fencer, but I do know some people who it is. So there is another option. If someone is giving you strong downright blows, as some people would call them, okay, you can defend with a sloping and collapsing parry. Just enough, make sure you take the blow up here near the hand, just enough that you will be able to charge in underneath it. So what you could do is start off by wounding them repeatedly in the hand, and then when they make a big old swing and come in at you, Immediately go in under cover of here, getting it up nice and high to get a good shock absorbency here, taking it on the edge or flat, doesn't really matter, of the blade here. Get in as quick as you can before their blow reaches its full swing or full power, and then using your left hand, wrap their arm, grab their hilt, even grab the blade if you've got gloves on, or you can grab the base of the blade where it's not so sharp. But basically go in for a grab, control, grip, disarm. There's various other terms for it. So these are the two things. Don't play at this middle distance. Don't play a typical fencing game of looking to parry and riposte, because your sword and your hand will get destroyed. Either back out and thrust them in the hand every time they attack you, okay, even going down low and letting the point come up into their hand which is coming down, or when you get the opportunity to parry, and you do get one parry because you won't get to parry a lot with a blade of this strength, immediately parry and close in and grapple them. Okay, there we go. I hope that's been interesting and educational. If you've got different views on this, I'm always welcome to hear them down below. Thanks a lot for watching. Give me a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course be next time, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.